Let me thank Madam Townsend for your lovely remarks, and let me now turn over to the next speaker. It is now my pleasure to turn the podium over to one of our sponsors today, City National Bank. Representing the bank is Vice President and CRA Officer, Ms. Teresa Dawn Lucas. Please welcome Ms. Dawn Lucas to the podium. Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, President Steve Figueroa. Did I say your name right? Figueiredo. There you go. It sounds Italian. It's such a pleasure to be here today. On behalf of City National Bank, I'd like to thank you all for attending today. We are here today to find a common ground on the important issue of affordable housing. City National Bank is proud to be a sponsor at this event and a strong proponent of affordable housing. We invested over $100 million last year in multifamily housing with emphasis on low to moderate income communities. I'm proud to work for City National Bank. It supports its communities and it partners with organizations to collaborate on issues that affect us all, including that of NIMBY. This is why it's my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Steve Pontel. Steve is a nationally recognized leader in housing. He is also a BizFed Institute board member. Steve is the CEO and president of the National Community Renaissance, one of the country's largest nonprofit organizations, affordable housing developers managing over 10,000 units and housing over 27,000 individuals. That is remarkable. Steve has a Bachelor of Science from Cal Poly Pomona in City and Regional Planning and an EMBA from the Drucker School of Business in Claremont. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for today's first panel, Steve Pontel.
Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Thank you. So I was having a moment of panic that I was going to be trapped behind this lectern. And for those of you that know me, know that's some form of intellectual harassment or something that would keep me trapped back there. So let me ask this. How many of you think we have a housing problem? How many of you think we have a housing crisis? I mean, I would argue that the number one crisis facing the state of California is housing. You know, this is not very complicated. Basic human needs, food and so if we're not providing shelter for people that need shelter, they're going to find shelter, and it's not shelter we want them to have. And the challenge we have in California is the State Department of Finance currently indicates that we're 1.5 million housing units short for the people that live here today. 1 million. So if we built 1.5 million new housing units today, we'd be at even. And so just think about the consequences of that shortage. And how do people cope with that? The primary means of coping, and we'll go into this in some more detail, is overcrowding. And so the challenge we have is we as a society have accepted the fact, apparently, that it's not our responsibility to make sure people have adequate shelter, and it's okay for people to live in non-desirable conditions. And I think that the consequences of that and the costs of that are billions and billions of dollars, and ultimately the destruction of every neighborhood we have in the state, because by definition, you're exceeding design capacity. So if you design a neighborhood for population X, you put 2X in the neighborhood, what happens? The roads, water, sewer, police, fire, parks all deteriorate faster than they were designed for. And so ultimately it is in all of our interest to make sure that people have adequate shelter. And hopefully today we're going to talk about, okay, so what? So what do we do? So how many of you think Washington, D.C. is going to solve this problem for us? Oh, come on, not one? Linda, this is not against the state, but how many of you think Sacramento is going to solve the problem for us? One. We have one hand that thinks Sacramento can solve the problem for us. So who is going to solve the problem? It's got to be us, right? So turn to the person next to you and say, it's up to you. Turn to the other person and say, it's up to me. It's up to me. So hopefully today, our goal today is to have you leave with some information, some ideas, some thoughts, as MC said, to engage in the fight. Because unfortunately, there's a fight afoot, and if we're not adequately engaged in the fight, we're going to lose the fight because we're not even on the battlefield. And so today our goal is to give you information, ideas to be able to take back and implement so we can move the bar. We can begin to move the bar. And we're very fortunate today to have a number of panel members that are going to set the stage for the discussion. And then the ultimate discussion is going to be afterwards, where we kind of get into some more of the details on the second panel on moving NIMBYs to YIMBYs. And I'm very excited that we have one of the organizations that I want everybody here to get to know, join, and give them money is the Abundant Housing LA. Mark, are you here? So I'm giving you a shout out because my old favorite organization was BARF. How many of you are familiar with BARF? The Bay Area Renters Federation. My new favorite organization is Abundant Housing LA because they're engaging in the battle on the behalf of people in Southern California to make sure we have adequate housing, and they're new players in the game. And so that's something that we need to think about. And so there's a slide I think that's supposed to come up that shows some of the election outcomes. So real quick before Darren comes up and gives us the facts, one of the challenges that we have is because housing is such a critical need and yet people are fearful of more housing. Increasingly what happens in the state of California is we start trying to run ourselves out of the ballot box. Not a good way to legislate our future. And so recently, there were some of the ballot initiatives statewide that I'm like, seriously? Why are we voting on this? Really? This is on the ballot? So that issue aside, one of the things that's increasingly on the ballot is issues with regard to housing. And so these are kind of 4 categories to think about because I think you're going to see more and more of this. Category number 1 is more money for special needs housing, money for targeted population. And there's always going to be the need for subsidy for certain populations within our society. And that's a conversation for which we don't have anywhere near enough money. And when we eliminated redevelopment, we took $1 billion a year out of the production of housing for the most vulnerable of our population. 60% of the resources that were available in the state of California to build housing for chronically homeless veterans or families, people that have developmental disabilities, people that have other challenges, $1 billion a year got taken out of the equation. And so you are going to see some ballot initiatives in some region for narrow slices of populations that require some form of subsidy. That can be a good thing. The unfortunate part about it is we build affordable housing. We currently have projects under construction in Oceanside, San Clemente, Yorba Linda. We just finished Pasadena, Rialto, and we're under construction in San Bernardino. But the challenge is we build affordable housing, and it is the most expensive housing in the state because every bell and whistle and cost and string is attached to it. And so it is not inexpensive housing. It's incredibly expensive housing. And so then you need more and more dollars for subsidy. One of the other trends that's occurring is requiring affordable units in some kind of an inclusionary manner. And so this can be good, it can be bad. It depends on the market. And it depends on how much it affects the market. And so at the end of the day, one of the things to weigh in the balance is by making market rate housing more expensive, are we really moving the bar on making housing more affordable? And which of these initiatives' goal is really to make the production of market rate housing more difficult and more expensive? And how are they going to balance themselves out? And one of the real challenges we have is increasingly ballot box decisions about density and about development. And one of the things that's important to realize is we do not live in a democracy. People for some reason think we live in a democracy. We live in a representative democracy, which means we elect representatives to be able to govern. Because a pure democracy is ungovernable. It's unmanageable, and yet this is the trend around development that is going to make development that much more difficult if every single issue has to go to a vote of whatever the community jurisdiction is. The ability to produce housing is going to become that much more difficult. And then one of the other conversations that's underway is there used to be, and maybe there's pros and cons on this, it used to be the case that employers cared about housing for their employees. It used to be the case employers cared about their employees. And one of the elements of that was housing. And so one of the questions we have to ask ourselves as employers is, what are we doing to ensure that our employees have housing? And how are we engaged in that directly or indirectly? And so one of the things that's coming up is the concept of linkage fees, where if there's not housing for employees in a particular area, they're going to start assessing employers or commercial development, other types of development in housing fees. And so just not to say, my argument is the more we move towards the ballot box to try and make these decisions, the less precise and the less constructive these decisions will probably be. And it's an unfortunate example of how governance is not governing the way it should govern. You all know NIMBY, right? You all know banana. Build absolutely nothing anywhere. But the more dangerous one is NIMTOF. You all know NIMTOF? Not in my term of office. And one of the challenges we have with elected officials today, fortunately we don't have any current electeds, we have a soon-to-be seated elected, but one of the challenges we have with electeds today is they don't want to take the political heat. And unfortunately, when we get into the NIMBY-YIMBY conversation, the forces of no are better organized than the forces of yes. So with that as a backdrop, I'm going to change the kind of pattern a little bit here. I'm going to ask Darren to come up and give his presentation before I ask the other two panelists so that they can watch Darren's presentation. SCAG recently had a conference about housing. And the question, the subtitle, similar to the subtitle we have today, was not housing costs. And there's a report that I think Darren will give you a link to. The name of the conference was Mission Impossible, ? And then the second part was Meeting California's Housing Challenge. And out of that the goal of that conference, there were about 100 electeds, about 400 people there, was once again to equip people with the information to go back and fight for the production of housing for the people living in their communities. So with that, please welcome Darren Chitsey up to launch us off with data.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. Is there a clicker or is there
Is there a clicker?
Just tell you. Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Darren Chitsey with the Southern California Association of Governments. I have to say we've had a long partnership with BizFed ever since they first came into existence. We've been members and supported it because of the important work they do. So congratulations to Helen Institute and all the great work that it is doing. Maybe put the slide. The cost of not housing. So let me just stop right there real quick. Does everybody knows what the hardest part of solving any problem is? And I got to thank Steve because he already did that. He got all of you to admit there's a problem and that you're committed to solving it. So my job here is easy. I just got to give you a little information about what to equip yourselves with and lead the discussion after that. Because certainly there's no way that you can even begin this process about talking about it unless we agree that it's a problem. And one of the reasons why I think that's hard to come across is housing costs historically, and we want to be rising. That's a sign of a healthy and a vibrant economy. The newspaper reports out certainly home sale prices, and every time they go up, it's a positive. It's a positive, and absolutely that's something that's critical. And if your housing prices are not healthy and not sustained, there's serious problems in the underlying economy of the city, of the region, so forth. But at some point, there's a point when it becomes not healthy, and that cost of not having enough housing that's driving costs up too high because the supply isn't adequately there is causing other impacts for people throughout. Steve hit on a little bit, and we're going to talk about that before. So I think that's just an important place to start, is to say that, you know, cost and supply inevitably are linked. And when we talk about unaffordability, we've got to really dig deep to think about what it is that from a business standpoint, that many of you are representing business organizations, and from a public agency standpoint is the important issues that we need to highlight about why there's a balance there that has to be maintained, and we have an obligation to help on that. So click forward. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Southern California Associations of Government, or SCAG. We're a metropolitan planning organization. We're a council of government. We represent 191 cities, 6 counties. That's about 18 million people. We go from all the way from Ventura out to Imperial County to the Arizona-Mexico border. Our job is to think out into the future and to put plans and realistic solutions onto the table to the challenges that exist today. Historically, we were started about 50 years ago looking at transportation. Certainly quickly it became evident that you can't plan for transportation without thinking about housing, without thinking about employment, without thinking about the economy. And so our work is integrated into all those subject matters. So we do plans, we do research, we do analysis, and one of the things that I think certainly differentiates ourselves as an organization, we have a great ability to bring people together from diverse backgrounds, from diverse areas in Southern California, to really raise issues that are the most relevant to the time that we're in. So next slide. So most recently, and Steve alluded to it, we hosted a housing summit. Now, we represent Southern California, but it quickly became apparent that this conference could not just be about Southern California. As soon as we started those conversations, I think most often the Bay Area gets cited for their housing challenges because of what's going on in Silicon Valley, what's going on at the commute times, and their affordability issues. So they were eager to jump on board to raise this issue because oftentimes in Sacramento and elsewhere, this gets viewed as a Northern California problem. Southern California doesn't have a problem because our median household price is lower than in other parts of the state. But when we're going to talk about this a little bit more, when you put that in line with incomes, you quickly find that Los Angeles County is just as unaffordable as New York City, as San Francisco, as San Jose, because our income levels are not to the same level. So we brought together 400 people, 100 local elected officials, business leaders, others. How many of you guys were in the room? Anyone? Well, next time we got to make sure you guys are all there that we do another one because, and I will say we do have an economic summit coming up December 1st. Would encourage everyone to come. There's flyers outside. So in one of the things, there's 3 reasons why we did this. Number one is to get to what Steve just said. We've got to, as a region, accept that we have a problem and there's got to be something about it. 2, we have to understand how to solve the problem, get a little bit of conversation about how it is that we got there. And the 3rd is really to start putting some solutions on the table, knowing we're not going to answer it all in one day. There's going to be local solutions, there's going to be statewide solutions, and to start that conversation. So we think we accomplished that, and I think one of the signs that we did that is this conference is being held today. Next month, at the California Economic Summit, the issue is going to be discussed again. We've heard from legislative leaders in both the Assembly and the Senate that housing affordability is going to be one of the key priorities of the legislative session next year. So next slide. So let's talk a little bit about housing affordability and what that means. The chart up on the screen is statewide. It is on rents. And when you look at it, you can quickly see that the price of rents, of average rents, is certainly continued to rise, while income has basically become stagnant. And this is obviously more impacted the lower the incomes are. For instance, 60% of households with an annual income of under $35,000 a year pay 50% of their home costs towards housing. 50%. Think about what that does to the rest of their life, the rest of their livelihood, their ability to just take care of the basic needs. A couple statewide facts too. I think we know California is a high-cost state. Average or median income or median housing price about $450,000. We're at maybe in the mid $550,000s. When you look at all of Southern California, LA County is certainly higher than that. The median home price in the nation is $185,000. So, I mean, I think we know it's expensive here, but I think this gets back to Steve's point. Washington isn't going to help. This is not a national issue. This is a local issue. This is something we all have control and ability to influence and make better. Again, back on the rent side, when you think about a two-bedroom unit costing $1,300 a month, 28% increase since 2000. The median income in the state was about $62,000 in 2014. That's a decrease of 8% since 2000. So as rent prices have increased by 30%, income has dropped by 6%. Next slide. Well, what caused this? What all of a sudden happened to change that dynamic? I think we're on a university, and there's probably some economists in the room. It's a pretty simple answer, supply and demand. What have we been doing to think about the supply when we know the population's growing? Most of that in our region that we're looking over the next 20 years, about 3.5 million people of growth is just births over deaths. So let's look back historically to see what we've done and what times we did a good job. 70s, 80s, we were building pretty well. For every new unit, there was one and 3/4 person added. And here's where the challenge came. 90s, 2000s, our housing development dramatically reduced and our population included to grow. So just so you know, average about 2.7, 2.8 is a traditional household size. So that is obviously, we're just not meeting up with our basic demands. We've started to boost that a little bit more recently, but still, as Steve mentioned, statewide, we're 1.5 million back today, not to think about the future. So it's pretty easy to understand how we got here. But, you know, why wasn't that production happening? And here's some thoughts about what are the causes, about what caused our kind of stagnation in housing belt. The next slide. 4 things that we put on the table at our summit was certainly looking at the shift in fiscal incentives at the city level. There's been a lot of work on this going back historically that cities, when they're looking at what kind of developments they want to offer, there's fiscal incentives to bring in retail and not to build housing. That goes back 20, 30 years. That certainly had an impact. And more recently, we've seen loss of redevelopment and other issues at the local level that have, again, taken away some of those fiscal incentives to build housing. There's regulatory barriers. I think we all probably know this and have seen this. It's not easy to get housing approved. It's not easy for things to move through the process, both at the local level and at the state level. There's reasons for this, and there's a lot of positives from it, but there also has absolutely had an impact. Local zoning requirements, certainly another issue that, there's a lot of good reasons for why the rules were developed the way they were, but they've had impacts, and local governments really need to think about if they're going to be part of the solution, they're going to be part of the supply, what do they need to do? And we've talked about it, obviously today, it's not in my backyard in that sense that community members have forgotten that at some point along the way, somebody built their house, and somebody may not have wanted it to be there. So how do we, again, remind people that there's an obligation as from a human standpoint to think about future generations and think about what types of opportunities we're going to provide them, not just in education, not just employment, but without that housing availability there, without building it, tremendous impacts are going to come from that. And next slide. And so let's talk about those impacts a little bit, because I think it's important that we highlight it. When you look at what's happened because of our lack of building new and providing new housing options, certainly we've seen impacts on gentrification, where in communities that have traditionally more affordable units are getting more expensive, people that can afford those units moving out, longer commute times, and we're starting to lose a workforce. I think you've seen it numerous times in recent years when companies are leaving California. Certainly, they might cite the regulatory environment, the tax environment, but the cost of housing is part of it. Steve said, employers don't care about their employees' housing costs anymore. And maybe not true, maybe it is, but I know like an organization like Toyota, when they left South Bay to go to Plano, Texas, and I can tell you my in-laws live in Plano. There's not a city that's more appropriately named. But one of the things that they cited that they have greater, the housing stock is more affordable, education is and their employees wanted that, and they thought in the future as they're growing their workforce that is the type of talent they wanted to attract. And I can tell you, a friend of mine that worked there, saw him last night. He had to get a new job. He had a short commute in the South Bay, to the Toyota headquarters. Now he's going up to Century City, and he's not seeing his kids anymore. He's not seeing his family more because he's spending more time commuting and moving around. So there are impacts. That was a choice that he made not to move with the company. But that all of a sudden has other impacts that are driving on our local economy. Next slide. But as business leaders, I believe that you do have a heart and you're thinking about this from a social standpoint, but I know that you're also thinking about it from a straight business standpoint too. Is what does it mean economically to your businesses, the businesses you represent, your customers, your clients? And there's an impact. There's a direct physical and financial impact to that. For example, Los Angeles ranks 48 out of 50 in metro areas in millennial population growth. Think about that. This is Los Angeles County. This is often viewed as the place where people want to be. We are the tastemakers for the country, if not the world, and we're 48 out of 50 in millennial population growth. And when you think about why that is, affordable areas such as Houston and Austin are taking our millennials away with double-digit growth in their millennial population. And if you think it's just about anything but just being able to have a very affordable lifestyle within their means, I mean, that's what's driving it. That's certainly what's driving a big part of that. So when you take your workforce out, and I know your last conference that this institute held was on education and workforce housing, I think we all know if you don't have a future employment base, you don't have a future tax base, what's the future of that local economy? So we can't afford to lose a generation in this conversation, and that's why the time to act is now, and why it's important that this conference is being held today. Next slide. There's obviously public health impacts. Skipped over a couple one there. But let's talk about the counties that have the highest number of disinvestment occurrences. Los Angeles, Orange, San Bernardino, Ventura, these are all counties, Riverside, that are in our region. This is pretty amazing when you think about that. These are obviously some of the biggest counties, but you can't help but know, because of surveying, because of work that's been done with these firms, that housing cost is part of it. So the economic impact is real, and it's something that we have got to keep in mind, and we've got to push forward in solving it. And next slide. So Steve hit on this. Oh, we skipped around a little bit. So public health impacts. I think they're pretty apparent when people have longer commute times. They're spending less time with their families. The impacts on their personal health, whether it be not having enough time to cook dinner at home and eating worse food options, to not having exercise time, to spending more time in the cars, because at the end of the day, when there's not, the people are going to drive and move to where they can afford housing, and oftentimes that is farther and farther away from their job. And those certainly drive not only air quality impacts, but other public health impacts as well. Okay. So we touched on these a little bit. I think voters understand this. I think that's why Steve said probably, not the best way to deal with this is the ballot box, and that certainly is true. But we also have to understand that the residents, the community, they understand the issue. Otherwise, they wouldn't continue to be voting for that. And so we've seen, obviously, that voters are spoken loud and clear. So I think we all now have heard that, and not just take these measures to move forward on, but let's take all the other opportunities that we have in front of us and get moving. So next slide. I think we're out of order a little bit, but let me go to the next one. What can you do today? And I think this is where the conversation really starts. Does anybody think we don't have a problem now that we've gotten through that? Everybody understand maybe thinking about something they could do differently and how? Well, that's what I think it's all about, is that we each have an obligation in this process. It's not something that one person or one entity can solve, although we sure hope Linda is going to give us all the answers that the state has in their forthcoming housing report that we can jump onto. But we know that this happens at the local, it's solvable. I mean, there's nothing, there's no mystique about it. It just is going to take work. So we've got to get better coalitions educate people about how it is that you can show up to those council meetings, you can show up to those local decision-making entities, you can influence local elected officials and give them the power to say yes, because the reality is they're only hearing from the people that don't want to see new housing communities, that don't want to see new development. And I think that's a very, very important thing to do. Next slide, and we'll close here. We missed one there, but I think that also, so on the local level, there also is some state options that are available, and I think Linda's going to touch on that before. Oh, here we go. About a decade ago, Prop 1C was part of a large package of bonds on infrastructure and the housing side. There certainly was some successful programs that came out of that. We certainly are calling, hoping that HCD is looking very carefully at which of those programs were successful and want to help them refund some of those programs. So there's definitely is a state role on top of this. At the local level, it's multifaceted. Certainly there has to be the support regionally about where the needs are and how those needs get met. But there's got to be some work on expediting the permitting process, thinking about zoning, thinking about how projects can move through quickly and expeditiously without too much new fees on top of them, so we can really get some stuff on the ground. But we would also say that that's what today's about, is learning from you and hearing from you that are in the field, in the business community, to understand better what type of package we can put together. I'd say timing is obviously of the essence. Many of this, we're having the same conversation about a decade ago, and then when the bottom fell out of the real estate market, all of a sudden we lost momentum of a decade. So we've got to know that realistically, we're not predicting anything, but certainly there's understandably going to be some market corrections. We can't let this opportunity right now slow us up, because if not, it's going to take many more years before we get the momentum back up. So now's the time to act. Appreciate you being here today and appreciate you listening to us. So thank you very much.
So I would like to ask Webster and Linda to come on up and grab your chairs. Please give them a round of applause. So thank you, Darren. And there's a link. There were some copies. Ping, I don't know how many you brought, but there's some copies of a great infographic that SCAG put together that I encourage you to get a copy of. And then you go to their website and get a link to actually a full report that has all of this information plus a whole lot more. So what we're going to do is Webster Guillory, the former assessor from Orange County, and Linda Wheaton, from the California Department of Housing and Community Development, Director of their Intergovernmental Affairs, are going to each make some brief opening comments, and then we're going to have a fun, candid discussion. So Webster, the stage is yours.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And good morning, everyone. Good morning. Still morning? Yes? Yes. All right. Well, on one hand, I guess I should say I'm pleased to be here, but a couple of years ago, I retired. And MC called me a few weeks ago, and she said, "Oh, you're going to come out and be a part of this panel." And so I said, okay. I'm in Orange County, and I drove this morning up from Orange County to Burbank. So it was not like I didn't know what I was getting into, because I was born in Pasadena, okay? And so I said, well, 2 hours maybe, 2 hours. But thank God for Fridays now, right? And we have alternate work weeks. I actually got here in 1 hour and 17 minutes on a Friday morning. Unbelievable. So we don't have a traffic problem in Los Angeles and Orange County and things like that. That's out of the question, okay? Also, as I was preparing, I worked in the property business and what property and things are worth for more than 30 years, more than half of my life. And so I know a little bit about that and everything. And I kind of come from the school, over all my life. I've been involved in business and business structure. And I espouse to the fact, that in this country, we are capitalists. And people do things, they do things better out of capitalistic motive. And so while I'm here and I came up and I want to listen in on the process and everything, and don't misunderstand me. I've spent my whole life in working with and helping people and things like that, but I also have to look at the whole enchilada. And if we're going to build housing, it has to make business sense. Just let that think in for a minute. It has to make business sense. And it won't, if it just makes social sense, I don't build any housing. Developers don't build housing because it makes social sense. They build housing to make money. Okay? And it took me a little while to learn that in the business that I was in for so many years, you know. But I can tell you what things cost, and I can tell you what they're worth. I did it for 1 million units of housings for 30 years. I know in this part of the country what things are worth, and I know what they cost. And I know what it takes to build them. And people only build housing if they make money. So then we come to these other issues. We say, well, what about the social side? You know, some developers ought to build housing out of the goodness of their heart. Out of the goodness of their heart. I don't know where that goodness would come from, okay? Because when on that side of the issue. So there are a number of things, and as we kind of get into this discussion, we'll talk about them. But keep remembering that housing is a business. It's a business. Housing is a business. And then as I look around at some of the issues that are going on, it's coming up this morning, and a project that I've been involved with for years is kicking off over this weekend. We raise money for children who live in motels in Orange County. And since we started that project 10 years ago, we were feeding 200 kids every day. Every day, children who live in motels. In one city, which is one of our largest cities, Anaheim, in Orange County. Last night they fed 1,800 children. 10 years, 200 to 1,800. Okay? One city. What is the size of that same problem here in Los Angeles? And in San Fernando, and in Pasadena, and Burbank, and so on and so on. You know, this is a city of 8 to 12 million people. Orange County is a county of 8 to 12 million. Orange County is a county of 3 million. We're doing 1,800 kids a night just in Anaheim. Kids who live in motels because their parents, half of the kids sleep in the car, some of them sleep inside a one room with 1 or 2 beds maybe, right? So there's no question that there is a problem. And to me, I'm honored to be here to kind of listen to you all about this issue. From time to time I get to talk about it. So people talk to me a lot about property taxes and a number of things. And I used to get developers who would visit me all the time and they'd say, look, Webster, I'm building an affordable housing project. And you know, this thing would really work out real well if we could make those units tax exempt. Okay. So I say, okay, it sounds interesting and everything. That would work out real well, be a little more profit in it. Maybe it works out a little bit better. You could build a little bit better unit and everything. But the people of California don't give me that authority. Right? Because you still consume roads and bridges and streets and lights and schools and so on. So in California, the citizens here decided many years ago that we would pay for the ongoing infrastructure and things through what? Property tax. Okay? So we don't have that authority to do certain things. But there has to be some will in this area. And really it comes down to, everyone says, oh, they have to be subsidized housing then. Yeah, I imagine so. I don't work in that side of the business, but we talk about subsidies. And then someone said, well, that's still a tax, right? On some of us versus others and so on and so on. It is a very interesting problem. So I'm going to close on my remarks by just kind of saying some things. You know, we also live in a time, and someone used the word, Steve this morning earlier used the word disruptive technology. We are on the spear, tip of the spear, in changing technology. When I was a young engineer 50 years ago, and we talked about what would happen in this country 50 years later. Well, you know, we still live exactly the same way 100 years later than we did 100 years ago. We still drive cars that are run on gasoline and other things. Houses still get electricity brought in the same exact way and everything. The Jetsons ain't here, y'all. Okay, 100 years, right? And I have an aunt that's 102 years old, you know, and she says, well, you know, for me, the only thing that changed is they moved the toilet inside. And she says, you know, we don't use candles anymore late at night. She said, but there's not much else has really changed in her 102 years. When you kind of just break it down to the very basics, okay? So where are we going to be in 20 years from now and so on? So I look back on my technology side and I said, where were we 10 years ago in technology? And look where we are today, right? Last night, one of the scientists said, I think on TV, he said, this little device here has 20,000 times or 500 more times capability than the first moon, the first ship we sent man to the moon with, right? So if they had this little thing right here, they could have gone on maybe somewhere else, right? But anyway, but here we are. We talk about autonomous cars today, save lives. People will be able to just get in the car and say, take me to Burbank, and I could have slept another hour. And this morning, we talk about other types of technology, disruptive technology, which are going to be key things in our life as we move forward. So my thing to you all is this morning is just, what is your issue? What is your issue? Think about what is your issue. And build some passion about those things. What is your issue? We kind of did this during this election. We asked a lot of people, what are your issues? What things are important to you? And we got a kind of an outcome that a lot of people are screaming and hollering about right now. But I, being an elected official for 16 years, I learned a long time ago, the voting public is always right. The voting public is always right. They get it right. Because there's 50 million of them voted that way, even though you may have been in the 50 million this way. But they are always right. They are right. 50 million people, are they all wrong? Are 50 million of them wrong? Something to think about. What are your issues? What are your issues? What are the things that you build passion about? And we as a democracy, we do the best when we build passion on both sides. And we talk it out. And we make it happen on this issue and things like that. But housing, our issue today, is only going to be built if we can make a business case for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda.
Okay. Thank you, Steve, and thank you, BizFed, very much for, I'm very happy to be here today. Steve and Darren have done a very good job of providing an overview of the very serious, severe housing crisis that we face in California and frankly have faced in a growing sense. While he's absolutely right, neither we can't expect Washington or Sacramento to solve this problem. The state of California has provided a very good set of tools to be used by its citizens, including its businesses, the private and public sector, working in partnership to both increase our housing supply and address our housing issues. Next slide, please. To address our housing issues. I think that's a good idea. I think I will stand
Because you
up.
can see that looking behind you all the time.
Is there a mic here? Maybe I don't need it. Okay, so there is a full spectrum of tools that can be used. So for example, one that we have worked with in conjunction with SCAG, it plays a very important role, is the housing element law. So every city and county in the state has to have a plan for how it's going to address its housing needs. And these include a whole spectrum of identifying both regulatory and resource issues, including citizen participation. So first, it's an important tool to get your citizenry to understand the needs and the role of the housing tools available in each of the communities. We have what is essentially a voluntary inclusionary measure in the state density bonus law to incorporate and get additional incentives in a regulatory sense for including some restricted affordable housing units. We have, just this session, we had reinforcement of the potential role of second units, accessory dwelling units. Two bills were passed, AB 2299, the Bloom bill, and SB 1069, the Wachowski bill, for accessory units. So there's a much bigger role for second units within our single-family neighborhoods. We have an act that reinforces where plans have been put in place appropriately to reinforce the obligation of development to be approved pursuant to them in the Housing Accountability Act, otherwise known as the anti-NIMBY law. There's provisions that if downzoning occurs, that other capacity needs to be made available. There are limitations on CUPs in multifamily, an emphasis on considering the costs of zoning implications, Article 34, express resolution for inclusion of affordable housing, and we have state fair housing laws in addition to federal fair housing laws reinforcing anti-discrimination provisions. Next slide, please. So we have traditionally, between the federal and the state government, provided some form of direct assistance all along the income spectrum of housing. So we have needs all the way from going at the lowest level to homelessness to long-term home ownership, everything in between in both sectors. And the biggest subsidy, of course, given in the housing sector is the mortgage interest deduction above this. So we have in the past, in the state of California, for example, in recent decades, has with bond financing provided assistance all along this spectrum. Today, what's the biggest program that the state is housing program or at the state level that we're involved in? It's called the No Place Like Home. It's the Mental Health Services Act, $2 billion focused on homeless. And so that there will be a dedication and there will be a set-aside pass-through for Los Angeles from that. But about a year ago, I did an exchange with a housing colleague in London and was very interested to note in a city as large as London with a growing population, I didn't probably in a month see, I could count the number of homeless on the streets maybe on two hands. My colleague came back with me to San Francisco immediately, and it's a very different story. So and housing, and of course, London is known for being one of the most expensive cities in the country. So the obligation to use the tools to increase supply is something that we have to do without, as Steve referred to, just turning to one-by-one initiatives and doing something. There's a limit to what we can do in a regulatory basis, kind of on a one-off basis. Next slide, please. So one of the, an important report recently that came out that kind of focused on this was the McKinsey report, and they had a toolkit to closing California's housing gap. And so one of the things that the McKinsey, this report did was identify the potential for increased development. This is an example in this area, just if you were to take in underutilized development capacity within existing urbanized areas. Now, it's one thing to say conceptually, theoretically, that this is available, but to actually realize our objectives for more infill housing, for developing within developed areas in our urban footprint, we're going to have to use those tools. It's going to take citizen support. It's going to take education across the sectors, both public and private, for identifying that, as we indicated, as a priority for individually, for households, and for our communities, and working in partnership across the sectors. Next slide, please. So we are soon to release a draft statewide housing plan update that will engage this conversation and those tools, helping educate, as continuing on today, what kind of tools the state does have available, what the status of programs that might address some of those are, and going forward with a plan for the future. So we will have workshops around the state, probably beginning in December, January. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So I'm going to kick it off with a few questions for the panel members, but I'd like everybody to be thinking about your questions, because once again, our goal today is to equip you with the information you need to go back and make something happen. So that's the goal. So Darren,
Yep.
The state of California is working on their vibrant community strategy. Can you just talk a little bit about that and what maybe some of the challenges might be if that were to fully come into play?
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I was remiss in my presentation to thank the two people that really put our conference together, is Ping Chang and Roland. Thank you guys so much. Those are SCAG staff here, and I just want to make sure they got recognized for really all the great work in there, and the report that Steve mentioned. You should download it. So what's going on in Sacramento right now, there's been, the governor's primary goal has been working on climate change and addressing climate change, and it's obviously a very critical, an important issue for the region, for the state of California, and really the world. But what has been kind of directing that discussion is sometimes come into conflict with some of the other state priorities when it comes to housing, when it comes to transportation. And the document that Steve referenced caused some concern, nothing in there in the specifics of it, but the overall discussion about the state's role in determining land use patterns throughout Southern California, throughout the state of California. And the Vibrant Communities document was a white paper that was produced really in conjunction with the update of the California Air Resources Board scoping plan. And this is, again, a document that's put out that is supposed to look at all the various ways that California can meet their newly adopted ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets, which obviously are very critical. But one of the challenges, I think, that is starting to come out, and certainly some in the business community have raised it, and various other public agencies, is how do all these goals really fit together? We know there's a housing shortage. We know we have congestion problems. And one of the ways that the state has been looking at addressing primarily the greenhouse gas reduction targets is through reducing vehicle miles traveled. And we know historically, obviously, there's a very, very tight link in GHG emissions and vehicle miles traveled. But as we look to the future and we think about what's happening in technology, and Webster started to allude to it, automated vehicles, electric vehicles, perhaps that nexus isn't as important as it once was, because there's so many other ways now we can meet our climate change goals. So the document in the Vibrant Communities strategy is talking about how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled by the state having a more direct and active role in where land use is cited in conjunction with other things. And so I think that's one of the things that it just pinpoints how complicated the state is, how complicated the priorities are, and how we really need to make sure all these priorities are working towards the same goal and not exacerbating one problem while trying to solve another, no matter how important it is.
Right, and just to put I'll have Linda weigh in on that, but just to kind of put one of the challenges is it costs about $600 a square foot to build high-rise residential in downtown LA, and it costs about $57 a square foot to build single-family detached in Beaumont or Banning. And so if you're thinking about the affordability of housing, trying to concentrate high density in the most expensive areas isn't going to help on the affordability side. So there's a balancing that needs to come into perspective. Linda?
So I think the document that Darren that is referenced, the vision document, was just that for consideration, and it's not prescriptive in terms of any greater control in state land use, but will be how it plays out in terms of the aspirations. Don't support development just in the most expensive areas, but do advocate incentivizing higher density development and development within the existing developed carbon footprint of all of our communities, not merely the downtowns, the cores of our expensive cities, but there's a role for all communities. So we have the more efficient use of land does play an important role. And so it remains to be seen how those objectives that were proposed play out. So you should all participate in the review, for example, of ARB's draft scoping plan update, which will be entering public comment period in early December. But essentially, the kinds of incentives for development matter everywhere. So increasing the supply needs to happen in all of our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great comment. And one of the benefits of BizFed is for every single association or organization to have to try and weigh in and filter through and provide comments in the documents would be very problematic. But collectively, the voice of all of the business interests in LA County together can have a huge impact, and that's one of the real opportunities with BizFed. Webster, and then I have a question for you, but go ahead.
Well, someone said it, I don't know whether you said it or Steve, whether you said it, but you said balancing needs to happen. A balancing needs to happen. Who's going to make that balancing? So all these reports and things like that, people want to live where they want to live. And so we're building at $600 a square foot in downtown LA, and some folks are building at $57 a square foot in Banning and things like that, but people aren't running to go out and live in Banning. And so earlier, someone talked about, and again, we want to go back to these things, we live in a democracy, representative democracy. And in many, many respects, our representatives who represent our state and people that we send to represent us in Sacramento and things like that, we've not done a good job in educating them. We've done a terrible job, maybe, because of the results that we've been getting for the last 15, 20 years, in educating those folks that we're sending to Sacramento about the balancing that needs to take care, and the representative, they have to represent. Of all 40 million of us cannot be voting on where housing should be built and where people should live and things like that. But it is necessary to all of you that we deal with this issue of, where's the supply and where's the demand. We've got to deal with that. And we have to deal with where maybe adjusting the demand into other places where the supply is and vice versa and so on like that. And we need to start working on those things early on so that we make that balancing happen mentally with people that are going to live here in Southern California. In my part of the world, everybody said, well, just build higher, right? Don't worry about the fact that you're running out of land, just build higher. And they said, oh, don't worry about the fact that there's no more space to build roads, just build higher. And on and on and on. So the balancing is not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult and so on. But the technology is going to help in some of those areas, I think.
So let me, and these are a couple of tough questions, Webster, so we're going to have some fun with this. Because one of the challenges we have is the market works until there are significant distortions in the marketplace. And one of the challenges we have is there are massive distortions in the marketplace. And so I recently gave a presentation, 6 months ago in Costa Mesa, and the average age of the audience was probably 60 plus. And it turned into a pretty, as a matter of fact, I got these stitches as a result of that public hearing. But the challenge, and this was an audience of people that they own housing, they live in Costa Mesa, and they're very fearful about changes in their community. Yeah. And we build subsidized housing, and they're really fearful about those people coming into their community. Yeah. And so when I pointed out, and so I asked this very harmless question, I said, how many of you take the mortgage income tax deduction that Linda just referred to? So how many of you take your mortgage income tax deduction? Let's see your hands. Come on, fess up.
If you own a house, you take the mortgage income tax.
So that is the largest federal subsidy for housing that we have, about twice the amount of the entire HUD budget. And then I asked, how many of you are living in pre-Prop 13 property tax houses? Huh? You are the most highly subsidized population on the planet.
Love it.
And so what happens is, there's a distortion in the market when you're paying $1,000 a year for your property taxes and the young family with 2 young kids moves in next door and they're paying $1,000 a month for their property taxes, what's your incentive to move to free up that inventory? So my question to you, Webster, is what do you think about, how do we address the distortions that are in the system that are not allowing the market to move and the movement of people? Because one of the challenges is seniors want to age in place. But they don't want to necessarily age in their big house. But they're not the opportunity to build alternative housing that may have a smaller footprint and smaller space in their neighborhood, in their community. So what are your thoughts on those distortions that occur that are really having a lot of influence on housing?
I have a mother, she's 95 this year, and she says, respect your elders. You all are offering great respect to your elders, okay? Giving us those great subsidies so we can continue to live. All right, so tongue in cheek. So I lived through Proposition 13, and I lived through all of the won't it be awful and all of the other things. And we still, I guess, maybe understand why we passed Proposition 13 in California. And for sure, we see some of the benefits, and then we see some of the difficulties. It's a balancing act again. There's a balancing situation going on. People say, well, there is no question that the people over, probably in Orange County, probably 80,000 homes still have a Proposition 13 1975 base year for taxes. And sure enough, that $2 or $3 million home today is only paying about $10,000 a year in property tax, okay? That's where they are. And so that is a tremendous subsidy, you can say, to those folks that live there. Of course, it's not a subsidy to them. They moved in, they bought that home, and they have lived in it and maintained it, and they paid property taxes all along. Today, of course, they will argue that I don't have children in school, and all of the other things that go on. So I'm still paying my fair share. I'm probably paying for someone else, even in my $10,000 assessment. So there are a lot of issues there that need to be dealt with, and I have people come to me all the time, and they say, will you talk a little bit about shouldn't we change Proposition 13, and why wouldn't we change Proposition 13? And so I will say to you that the numbers that, if you take a look at just the numbers alone, there's not numbers there to make you do anything with it, because most of those folks, there's only 89,000 out of 1 million properties on the roll in Orange County, about 89,000 have a Proposition 13 base. So the other 920,000 have many multiple base years, of course, because they're not all today at market value, because we don't value property, we don't assess property in California at market value. But so it's over time, the situation is adjusting. And many of the seniors, Costa Mesa and around, many of those seniors are downsizing. So we passed Proposition 8 in 1983 that allows seniors to take their value and move. A lot of seniors don't know that. But they can take their Proposition 13 value and they can move to a home of equal or lesser value, and they can take their base with them. And that frees up a 5-bedroom home. They move into maybe a 2-bedroom. And so those of you in the real estate business, talk about moving people. I do it often. I did it often all over the state. Talk about helping people to understand that they can move and downsize and still they can take the benefit of their Proposition 13 base year value with them, free up a property that a larger family needs. They don't need that home any longer. So those are some things there that we really can work on in knowledge and helping our representatives to understand these things also, and so on. If you ask me a little bit about Proposition 13 and things like that, it's a difficult nut, because the voting public, being that they are always right, it's going to be very difficult to move them off of something that gives a tax break to seniors in the state of California. Even 35 years later, it's going to be difficult.
And I'm not advocating either way, but it is a matter of educating people about the consequences of the subsidy and the distortions it creates in the marketplace. And so let me ask each of you a final question, then I want to open it up to make sure if you start having questions, do I have the only hands-free mic in the room? Oh, there's another one. Okay. So start letting the gentleman with the microphone know, and then we'll make sure we get, hands are going up all over the place. So this is the last question each of you can give a kind of a quick answer to. And so Darren, I'm going to start with you. What argument would you use with the city to convince a city that building housing is in their own best interest? I mean, what's the one message you try and get across to local electeds and city leaders about why housing is an important economic benefit for their city?
Well, I can tell you one of the things that is the biggest challenge for an organization like us. We're a membership organization. Our cities and counties pay member. They voluntarily join us, and Linda referred to it before as the Regional Housing Needs Assessment Program. So we have those conversations frequently on a period of time where we're putting in and we're identifying with the state what each city types of housing they need to build in terms of affordable, extremely affordable, and market rate housing. And the conversation isn't just one item. I think that we always try to talk about the larger regional picture, and that certainly every community has a role in that. We understand that in transportation, that you might build a road that people might drive through your community on. It's not just for your residents. And so if each and every city isn't thinking about what is in the collective interest for the region as a whole, the economic impacts quickly trickle back to that city specifically. So there has to be a specific conversation and understanding about what the overall need is, what the specific city need might be, and what are the implications if every other city surrounding them were to not make the tough decisions that are in front of them.
I'm going to co-sign on to what he just said. But one of the things that for many years I worked in downtown Santa Ana, and over the years I watched the population of maybe 40 or 50 homeless people grow today to where it's 550 people every night sleep in the Civic Center in the city of Santa Ana. Every night, 550 people sleep on the lawns because the courts rule that you can't run them off the lawns, and so on. So you look around, and I used to sit and visit with the gentlemen and ladies who live there and talk with them and kind of get a sense of where they are. Many of them are veterans. Many of them have some mental issues and problems and things like that. But they're people. They're living their life the way that they think is best for them. And the guys, they like to sit around and talk with guys who had experiences like they did. So they love to just congregate in the city downtown Santa Ana. And then in the other cities all around, we have that column. It's called the Ain't It Awful column. And I contend that every city, because even in the city where I live in, you see one or two homeless people maybe a day out on the street. There's more there than that, but you see them walking around, pushing a basket or whatever. Everybody go, oh, ain't it awful? Well, I think that in every city and state and everywhere else, and SCAG too, you guys ought to have an ain't it awful column. And every time you look at a situation and you say ain't it awful, then we ought to take, well, you know what? What can we do? What can we all do to deal with everybody's ain't it awful column? And if we just start thinking about that and we all kind of kick in a little bit, we might be able to take a lot of things out from under the ain't it awful. So just something to think about. But we all go, oh, isn't that awful? Poor Santa Ana, isn't that awful? Poor Costa Mesa, isn't that awful? And if you see somebody homeless in Newport Beach, you go, oh my God. Okay, oh my God, isn't it awful? And so on. So, the conversations go on and everything, but it's going to boil down to all of us. And, I look at this room and thank God for you all who put this together and everything, and I only came because I think it is a subject that we cannot get away from because it's an awful subject. And to see homeless people, I grew up through the 50s, and we had some homelessness back then and things like that, but today we're right back proportionately to the same, but the numbers are much larger. But you can't even imagine. If you don't get out and go in places where I go and things like that and get around a little bit, don't leave your neighborhood maybe, you can't imagine the homelessness that exists in our country and in your city and in your backyard, the homelessness and things like that. It is awful. And we need to start dealing with it. The richest country, the richest state, forget country in the world, just the richest state, the richest cities anywhere in the country and things like that. And we have people who sleep in the bushes, children who sleep in cars and in the bushes every night. Not just a few. I know 1,800 of them in one city that come out for meals, come out of the dark and out of the cars and out of the places where they sleep, out of the ditches and other things. 1,800 come out for spaghetti and a meal every evening. Ain't it awful?
So I think part of this is related to issues of civic engagement and generational change. So partly and if we want to get people to understand in our community that this is a common issue affecting us all and we're not going to just be able to have it get so bad so that we then address just a part of the spectrum of the need, we need more common understanding. So it relates to working on civic engagement and in particular with our youth. We have a generational, as we've talked about here, we're handing our millennials one heck of a problem. And getting them engaged in and understanding, frankly, is going to mean some new ways of civic engagement. I have a 26-year-old son who had to do a grant program. He started out and he had to be in charge of a public hearing. He goes, what's this public hearing stuff? So, their generation is not used to that form of communicating and dealing. We need a lot more we need to come up with a lot better ways of engaging our youth and outreach and having them buy in and help develop new choices for how we address these issues. We have tools, as I've indicated, to build upon, but we need to reach out.